Quite a few of my more recent videos have involved the idea of the synthetic cult, that the empire is very skilled at drawing from mythology, the beliefs, the proclivities of a certain people or culture or region, and are able to concoct synthetic cults that seem to engage or satisfy the so-called spiritual impulses of the population, and then harnesses that. The empire is then able to harness that and basically pacify people, keep them in a state of inaction and unawareness. And the empire has been skilled at this, has been doing this for several millennia now. And this is an article from Executive Intelligence Review again. This is an amazing article, fascinating stuff. Volume 29, number 49, 20th of December 2002, EIR feature. And if some of you remember the last video on the Sufis, we have this same gang of plotters and schemers ensconced in the British Empire and in Oxford and Cambridge and British intelligence and Freemasonic networks. We have here H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell. And this article is called H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, the No Soul Gang, referring to the Venetian oligarchy's claim that people don't have souls, that's an illusion. The No Soul Gang behind Reverend Moon's Gnostic Sex Cult by Lawrence Hecht. We start with a quote from H.G. Wells. It is just that unwillingness to think evil that may presently erase the British from the scroll of living significant peoples. H.G. Wells, Experiments in Autobiography. This, maybe many of you remember the Moonies from your youth, hearing about them, wondering about them, and another example of a synthetic cult. Anyway, back in the 1970s, when the Reverend Sun Myung Moon's Gnostic sex cult freak show was in its mass recruiting phase, the Moonies were the American parents' worst nightmare. Moon was the zombie maker, the body snatcher who came in the night or when children were away at college and stole their souls away. There was much basis, in fact, for this fear, as anyone who had ever looked into the vacant eyes or attempted to converse with the vacated mind of a Moonie will recall. Today, this lunatic leader of a mass cult is the titular head of a multi-trillion-dollar, keep in mind this is 23 years ago, multi-trillion-dollar worldwide apparatus of government influence peddling and control that knows no equal. So you might want to think of a parallel, and you might arrive at Jeffrey Epstein and maybe the Nexium cult, and maybe kind of a confederation of similar influence peddling and blackmail going on. Moon literally owns whole countries in South America and Asia. His apparatus is rapidly buying up the U.S. Congress, the presidency, and all potential opposition forces of left, right, and center. Moon's stock and trade is cash and sex. Lots of it. The cash comes from the worldwide drug and gun running operations, doesn't it always? Part of which came to the surface in the Iran-Contra scandal. Cocaine from the South American trade run under cover of Moon-linked CAUSA group, heroin from Afghanistan and the Far East, laundered through dirty money operations of the Moon cult that overlapped Ollie North's extracurricular activities while at the National Security Council. The sex is a specialty of Moon's own Gnostic family cult. Remember the congressional madam scandals of the 1970s featuring Ton Sun Park and Susie Park Thompson? That was just the tip of the iceberg of the Reverend Moon's sexual favors operation. Military intelligence officers who investigated unification church operations in Washington in the 1970s and 80s report that the recruitment device used on ranking conservative political and military officials was to hold weekly orgies arranged by Colonel Bo Hee Pak, the Unification Church official who was a top officer of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, KCIA. Who knew? The special treat at these affairs were the little angels, Korean schoolgirls brought over by Moon as a ballet troupe. The photo files from these sessions are reported to be a powerful influence in certain circles to this very day. But they didn't stop at congressmen and high-ranking military. Moon now owns the religious right from Jerry Falwell to Gary Bauer and has bought up most of the independent black ministers, the former base of the civil rights movement, to boot. Wow, just think about that. Here we are in 2025. Just think, this wasn't that long ago. Just take a moment to reflect and think about where we are now and how this operation set up what we are dealing with now. Moon uses his ample supplies of money, gold-plated watches minted in his own factories, and his private stock of Asian brides for the most corrupt. Moon also owns a substantial chunk of the business operations of Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam. Farrakhan had been appearing regularly at Moon-sponsored events since 1996, in one case on the same podium with the former Attorney General Richard Thornburgh and former Vice President Dan Quayle. Remember him? After the events of 9/11, Moon focused his sights on the traditional Muslim religious community and is making inroads into mosques across America. Moon also runs the central control points of world academic opinion. My God. This is really heavy stuff. I mean, for people who think that, or might think that my channel's a bit esoteric, my God, no, this is only 23 years ago. Look at the scope of this thing. I mean, you might say, well, nobody talks about the Moonies now, but what did it achieve? What did it consolidate? What did it organize? What did it prepare the way for? Probably something worse that maybe doesn't, that we can't name. Exactly. You know, we could always label it the Moonies. But what are we looking at today? This didn't just vanish. Through his international conferences for the Unity of Science and Federation of World Professors, Moon pays 6-digit honoraria to leading scientists with emphasis on using their reputations to promote population control, artificial intelligence, and world federalism. My God, the three pillars of the WEF. We're going back a couple decades, and look, we're seeing it all tied up with being advanced, promoted by the Moonies. Moon owns the second major daily in the national capital of the world's greatest power, the Washington Times, and the second largest wire service, United Press International. He controls industries around the world, ranging from food production and distribution to arms manufacture, including the original producers of the Thompson submachine gun. Senator Joseph Lieberman, Democrat, Connecticut, recently received the 2002 Truman Reagan Freedom Award from the Mooney Front Group, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. In 2000, Senator John McCain, Republican, Arizona, presided over the award presentation. The president of this foundation, Lee Edwards, is the editor of the Sun Myung Moon magazine, The World and I. Its public liaison officer is society editor of Moon's Washington Times. Included on the National Advisory Council of this Mooney front are former National Security Advisors Zbigniew Brzezinski, former Senators Robert Dole, Dennis DeConcini, and Claiborne Pell, former UN ambassador and now head of the American Enterprise Institute Jean Kirkpatrick, the head of the Heritage Foundation, and many more officials of respectable organizations and talking heads you see on television every day. There they are. Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells. So, who or what is Moon? So who really is the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, and what is behind him? The answer is not what you think. The Moon operation is not a simple case of penetration by a foreign intelligence agency. He is neither a right-wing conspiracy, nor a communist plot, nor a creation of Jewish bankers, nor is he the special property of some all-powerful secret society, as dreamed of by some populist-minded conspirophile. To understand what makes the moon clock tick is to know the real history of the 20th century. Not the fairy tale version set forth in school books and newsstand gossip sheets. We shall show you in this article that the moon cult is the spin-off of two British intelligence operations of the 1920s and 30s in which the figures of Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells play the prominent role. We shall begin by briefly summarizing these two operations. Then, to make sense of them, we shall go back in history to the beginning of the past century, and even a bit earlier, to discover the motives and means by which these things could be carried out. It is a shocking story, but a coherent one. Stay focused, and you can grasp it. The two operations of Wells and Russell's from which Moon sprung are these. 1. The Moral Rearmament Movement. Founded at a 1921 meeting between a wacky Lutheran preacher from Philadelphia and two British delegates to the Washington Disarmament Conference, Lord Arthur Balfour and H.G. Wells. Let me read that again. The Moral Rearmament Movement. So these are the two operations giving rise to the Moonies. Founded at a 1921 meeting between a wacky Lutheran preacher from Philadelphia and two British delegates to the Washington Disarmament Conference, Lord Arthur Balfour and H.G. Wells. Moral rearmament became the mass organizational vehicle for implementation of Wells's 1928 call in The Open Conspiracy should read that if you haven't already. For a worldwide movement for draft resistance. The environment of Moon's Korean ministry was under control of moral rearmament when he was picked up as an intelligence asset during the Korean War. 2. The Unity of the Sciences movement. Founded in 1935 under the supervision of Lord Bertrand Russell and John Dewey, it brought together Trotskyite academics Albert Wohlstetter, mentor of the current Defense Policy Board Chairman Richard Pearl, Sidney Hook, and Ernest Nagel, with members of the radical positivist Vienna Circle. Merging with Robert M. Hutchins at the University of Chicago in the 1950s, this operation took over the teaching of science in the United States. Thomas Kuhn's widely read Fraud, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, was published as a second volume in their Encyclopedia of Unified Sciences. In 1972, the Moonies were given the Unity of Sciences franchise, sponsoring the first of their still ongoing international conferences of the Unity of Sciences. Their early sessions featured such notables as Manhattan Project physicist Eugene Wigner, the lifelong ally of that truly mad scientist Leo Szilard, the model for Dr. Strangelove in Stanley Kubrick's film of that name, and environmental fascists Alexander King and Aurelio Peccei, founders of the No Growth Club of Rome. No soul, no growth. Before looking back to the history of these projects, let us first briefly dispense with the person of Reverend Sun Myung Moon. Moon as a personality is of very little importance in himself. The real Reverend Moon is a pathetic, if nonetheless nasty, victim of Japanese internment in North Korean torture sessions. He is what the professional mind-benders who operate under military intelligence cover call a synthetic personality. Just the right sort of material for running a cult operation. Born in 1920, Moon had received some training as an engineer when he was first imprisoned by the Japanese during their extended occupation of Korea. Early in the Korean War, Moon was taken prisoner in the North and subjected to the hideous physical and mental torture that became well known to Americans of the time. Moon describes his so-called religious conversion while in North Korean imprisonment as my brainwashing. A sample or two of Moon's philosophy tells it all. Here is the Reverend Moon on the subject of the meaning of life. The purpose of life, into which we are all born, for a man is a woman, and for a woman is man. Man and woman are born to live for each other. The harmony of their body shapes and of their organs of love are simply made so. If you truly understand this fact, you have mastered more truth and more precious wisdom than an entire encyclopedia. God, the great King of wisdom, has placed our organs of love in each other's custody. Thus, the true master of the organ of love which a man or a woman possesses is not that person at all, but is their loving spouse. He made these comments, end of quote. He made these comments before the 15th conference of the International Conference on the Unity of Sciences in 1986. Moon has something of an obsession with sex and the sexual organs. A former Moonie and leader of one of Moon's pro-Vietnam War front groups recalled this anecdote, quote, I remember a day at Belvedere, the Moonies' Tarrytown, New York training camp, in May of 1973, during a leadership conference. Moon had just finished a short speech, and then he asked for general questions. I rose to my feet to address him. I said, quote, "As a one-world crusade commander, I frequently encounter the problem of homosexuality among our men," unquote. I asked him if there was anything we could do to help these people. He replied, "Tell them that if it really becomes a problem, to cut it off, barbecue it, put it in a shoebox, and send it to me." The audience roared with laughter. Or another sample of the profound depths of Moon's thought. When you defecate, do you use a mask? This is no laughing matter. This is serious. When you were kids, did you ever taste the cooties from your nose? Why didn't you feel that they were dirty? Because that's a part of your body. The Reverend Moon has discovered something that no one else had thought about. Wow. Pure genius. It all began at Appomattox. I think I'm saying that correctly. Appomattox. If the lunatic Moon is not the maker of his own madhouse, who is? The best way to answer that question is to take a closer look at the designers of the operation that produced Moon and the forces which shaped them. Introducing Russell and Wells. Most literate people know Herbert George Wells as a writer of science fiction stories. Bertrand Russell, his chief partner in evil, is best known as a philosopher, mathematician, human rights activist, and pacifist. This despite his repeated calls for a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union, and his often expressed desire that the spread of epidemic disease might reduce the world's population every generation or so. So that's in there too. Yet, even with such correction, the truth of which the present-day Russell acolyte Noam Chomsky was forced to concede at a recent public appearance at Rice University in Houston, one does not arrive at a true picture of these men or their role in the world. Russell and Wells, who orchestrated so much of the evil of the 20th century, were by birth and upbringing men of the 19th century, grown to manhood under the British Empire at the peak of its power, nursed on the tales of Kipling and the notion of the inborn superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. Yet, they were clever enough to foresee its demise and early on set themselves to the task of shaping a new world empire more fearful and more evilly conceived than the openly declared global tyranny which was Victorian England. In his Experiments and Autobiography, Wells wrote of his own childhood. "In those days, I had ideas about Aryans extraordinarily like Mr. Hitler's. The more I hear of him, the more I'm convinced that his mind is almost the twin of my 13-year-old mind in 1879, but heard through a megaphone and implemented. I do not know from what books I caught my first glimpse of the great Aryan people going to and fro in the middle plains of Europe, spreading east, west, north, and south, whose ultimate triumphs everywhere squared accounts with the Jews. I have met men in responsible positions, Ellis Amory, for example, Winston Churchill, George Trevelyan, C.F.G. Masterman, whose imaginations were manifestly built upon a similar framework, and who remained puerile in their political outlook because of its persistence. Wells only fails to note that the similarity of Hitler's outlook to the British one arises because Hitler was, like Moon, a synthetic personality and product of British intelligence occult bureau and Psy-war penetration operations run into Germany at the beginning of the century. The Russells were an English noble family that came to prominence in the reign of Henry VIII with the rise of John Russell, 1st Earl of Bedford. The Earl Bertrand Russell, 1872 to 1970, of whom we speak, was the grandson of Lord John Russell, 1792 to 1878, twice Prime Minister during the reign of Queen Victoria. Grandfather Russell, who raised young Bertrand, was an intimate of British spy master and longtime head of the Foreign Office, Lord Palmerston. Palmerston managed a veritable zoo of agents of all stripes, particularly of the radical anarchist and communist variety, Giuseppe Mazzini, Bakunin, and Karl Marx among them. A specialty of the house was the technique that came to be known as balkanization, the breaking up of a nation or opposing empire into divided parts. China, India, and much of Africa were subjugated this way, and Europe and Russia successfully held at bay. But the great prize was the United States, the lost colony whose reconquest was a central concern of British policy from 1783 onward. And this is the history of the United States that's very little known and completely obscured in academia. You can't find it anywhere. But is crucial to understanding the sort of schizophrenic nature of the United States that proclaims certain virtues and yet its behavior seems to reveal something much different, much exactly the opposite of what it claims to be. It's not just hypocrisy. There have been since the beginning, going back to the Revolution, and Aaron Burr, for instance, who was a British asset who set up Wall Street. There has always been a foreign, British-led penetration, infiltration by the empire in the United States. So let me go back and begin that again. It's extremely important. But the great prize was the United States, the lost colony whose reconquest was a central concern of British policy from 1783 onward. The Civil War was the last great effort to accomplish this goal by force of arms. That was Lord Palmerston behind the Civil War. Palmerston's agents in the Confederacy included Secretary of War Judah Benjamin and Teddy Roosevelt's uncle, James Bullock. But Palmerston lived just long enough to see the defeat of the Confederacy, Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and the immediately following assassination of President Lincoln by one of his disposable agents. And every U.S. presidential assassination has been carried out by this British secret intelligence apparatus. Kennedy as well. By the time that Palmerston died on October 18th, 1865, the world was changed forever. The United States was now a land power with the greatest army on the face of the earth and an industrial base that would shortly surpass England's own. If it was to be reconquered, it would have to be by subversion and deceit. The question of how exactly that might be accomplished occupied the thought and discussion of several generations of the British elite. And then the next section, I think I'll pick this up next time. Agnostics and Gnostics. We see on YouTube a lot. It's bandied about in the alternative content. Gnosticism and Gnostics. Perhaps we'll get to a more historical and accurate understanding of what that means. All right, this is fascinating stuff. Really heavy, really big stuff.